1,400 to 1,590 troops. The military structure that emerged during the course of the 14th century remained, in its essence, intact until the end of the 16th, with the Timar holding cavalry and the Janissaries forming the most significant bodies of fighting men. Of these, the Timar holders formed the overwhelming majority, although the first reliable statement of their numbers does not appear until 1525. A summary of the empire's receipts and expenditures in this year records 10,618 in the European provinces and 17,200 in Asia Minor and Syria. Each of these cavalrymen had to bring a certain number of armed retainers, and this would have brought the total numbers available up to about 50,000. Not all of these would have served at any one time, but the number is high enough to show that they formed the most important element in the Ottoman army. 4. More famous than the Timar holding cavalrymen but less numerous were the Janissaries. At the time of its foundation in the second half of the 14th century, the Janissary Corps consisted of perhaps a few hundred infantrymen, who served as the Sultan's bodyguard. In this role, they were an effective force and, having no other source of protection and patronage, reliably loyal to the Sultan. In the closing stages of the Battle of Ankara in 1402, it was the Janissaries who remained, fighting around the Sultan when the rest of the Ottoman army had deserted or fled. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, when a large part of the cavalry army had left the field, it was the Janissaries who stood firm around Murad II, 1421 to 51, and, crucially, captured and killed the Hungarian king. 5. Their numbers evidently increased during the course of the 15th century. A Greek source from the early 1480s reports that there were 5,000 at the accession of Mehmed II, 1451 to 81, and that Mehmed doubled this number at the time of the wars with Uzun Hasan in the early 1470s. Their number remained a bit above or below 10,000 for much of the following century. Payroll figures show 10,156 Janissaries in 1514. In 1527, there were 7,886 Janissaries and 3,553 novices. In 1567, there were 12,798 and 7,745 respectively. Apart from these, there were Janissaries serving in garrisons in the provinces. In 1560, for example, there were 3,377 in the fortresses of the province of Buda, on the frontier with Austria. 6. Before the second half of the 16th century, the Ottoman government seems carefully to have restricted the numbers of Janissaries. This was partly, no doubt, a measure to control expenditure, and partly to accord with the maxim of Lutfi Pasha, Grand Vizier from 1539 to 1541, that troops should be few, but they should be excellent. Another reason to restrict numbers was probably also to curtail their power. The Janissaries were an elite corps, and part of their effectiveness was the terror that they aroused in the enemy. But what was equally important was the fear that they inspired in the sultans. The loyalty of the corps to the Ottoman dynasty was never in doubt, but this did not preclude disloyalty to individual sultans. It was, in part, at least, a Janissary rebellion that forced the abdication of Mehmed II at the end of his first reign in 1446, and the return of his father Murad II to the throne. It was the Janissaries who forced the abdication of Bayezid II, 1481 to 1512, in favor of Selim I, 1512 to 20, and it was the Janissaries who murdered Osman II, 1618-22, and brought Mustafa, 1617-18, 1622-3, to the throne. In the short interregnum between the death of Mehmed II and the accession of Bayezid II, the Janissaries rioted and plundered parts of the capital. After the victory at Chaldiran in 1514, it was they who forced Selim I to retreat from Tabriz, and they rioted again in 1525. As an armed group stationed in Istanbul, the Janissaries were as powerful a force in the internal politics of the empire as they were on the battlefield. The Timar holders and the Janissaries were the major, but not the only components of Ottoman battlefield armies. The elite 6 divisions of cavalry regulars recruited largely from the graduates of the palace school accompanied the Sultan on campaign, as well as on ceremonial occasions. It is impossible to establish the date of their foundation, but it is clear that they were in existence by the time of Mehmed II, when the Greek source gives their numbers as 600 cavalrymen, sipahs, 600 swordbearers, silators, 700 stipendiaries, olyifjis, of the left and of the right, and 400 strangers, guraba, of the left and of the right. During the course of the 16th century, these numbers tripled. In 1527, they were 1993, 1,587, 1,007 and 415 respectively, and in 1567, 3,331, 2,785, 2,546 and 2,589. The increase in numbers was proportionally higher than that of the Janissaries, but they were still few in comparison with the Timar holders from the provinces. By 1607, their numbers had increased still further, to 7,805 cavalrymen, 7,683 sword-bearers, 3,448 stipendiaries and 1,903 strangers. By this time, however, the growth in Janissary numbers was much greater. 7. Contrasting with the Janissaries were the Azubs. These two were infantrymen, recruited according to Jacopo di Promontorio in 1475, from among craftsmen and peasants in Apos. Ottoman chronicles refer to the existence of Azubs already in 1389, but this may be anachronistic. It is clear, however, that the corps of Azubs was in existence at the time of the Hungarian Wars in the 1440s, and may well date from before 1400. The method of recruitment to the corps, at least in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, is clear from Bayezid II's Law Book of 1499. This text suggests that the government made the levies mainly in towns, appointing the local judge and sabashi to put it into operation, and demanding also the cooperation of the imam and another representative from each town quarter. Here they were to summon and inspect all the lads fit for war, rejecting any who were underage, disabled, too old, or slaves. From these they would select the Azubs. In addition to supplying these fighting men, the people of the quarter had to provide money for their expenses, up to a limit of 300 akshas per Azub. The system for apportioning the levy of both men and cash was by number of households, as the law book explains. If, for example, it falls to 20 households to provide one Azub, from among the 20 people provided by the 20 households in that quarter, one suitable one should be enrolled for Azub service. Expenses for him should be collected from the remaining 19 households. Only if the appointed group of households could not provide a suitable lad, should those making the levy look elsewhere. They should also appoint a guarantor for each lad, so that if he absconded, it would be possible to recover his pay. Finally, in order to ensure the regularity of the procedures and to prevent a series of abuses which the law book enumerates, it was a requirement to make registers of the levy. From each judicial district where Azubs are levied, there should be 2 registers. One should remain with the judges, and one should come to the palace, so that when there is a roll call of Azubs, or a guarantor is sought, it is possible to look either at the register which is with the judge, or at the register which has come to the palace, and to take action accordingly. In Apos, the Azubs, unlike the Janissaries, were not a corps of regular troops, and, although Jacopo di Promontorio in 1475 estimated their strength at 6,000, it is clear that their numbers in fact fluctuated according to military necessity. One account of the Chalderan campaign in 1514, for example, states that there were 10,000 Azubs from Anatolia and 8,000 from Rumelia serving in Salim I's army. 9 For the same campaign, Menevino puts their numbers even higher, at 30,000. Nor, unlike the Janissaries, were the Azubs an elite corps. The Azubs were conscripts whose lives were expendable. Like the Janissaries, however, they served both on the battlefield and in fortresses. Spandowns, in 1513, recorded the presence in garrisons of both Azubs and Janissaries. Writing of the Azubs, they are more numerous than the Janissaries, and if they are in a castle, the ones guard one fort and the others another. If they are garrisoning a town, the Janissaries will be in the citadel and the Azubs in the town, because the Janissaries are more capable and bold. If there are fewer Azubs than Janissaries, they could not last together. These Azubs have from 3 to 6 akshas a day as wages, and are mostly from Anatolia. Ottoman documents from throughout the 16th century continue to record both Janissaries and Azubs in fortresses. 10 From the second half of the 16th century, however, the Azubs seem to have lost their importance as battlefield troops. In the 1540s already, the Hospitaller Antoine Geoffroy commented, "As for foot soldiers, the Ottomans have none apart from the Janissaries, at least none that are worth anything." And Apos, the last important category of fighting men in the Ottoman army, were the raiders, akinjis. These were the lightly armed cavalry of Rumelia who, more than any other Ottoman soldiers, kept alive the fighting traditions of the early 14th century. They emerged in the Balkan Peninsula before 1400 as a distinctive body of soldiers, with their own hereditary leaders and structure of command. As lightly armed raiders who fought outside the periods of formal campaigning, and independently of the main body of the army, their existence was symptomatic of the continuous Kleinkrieg waged along the borders of the empire. Konstantin Mihailovich, who fought with the Ottoman army between 1453 and 1463, and Jacopo di Promontorio in 1475 provide the earliest descriptions of these troops. Mihailovich notes that they live by means of livestock and raise horses and oppos. He was probably right so far as concerns horse breeding, since the raiders provided their own swift mounts, and later Spandowns was to remark how they are all well mounted, because they have excellent horses and oppos. Their main source of living from the land seems, however, to have come from the cultivation of crops, on which the Sultan exempted them from taxation. Jacopo writes, they have the privilege of surviving on the holdings of the Sultan, as much as 2 or 3 pairs of oxen can plow, without paying tithe. A quarter of a century later, however, Spandowns was to observe, they have no wages and, despite this, still pay the tithes on their wheat and other food which they produce in the place where they live with their family. Similarly, they pay the expenses of the Timar holder or garrison troops in their town. And oppos. Most of their income, however, came from booty, whether they collected it during formal campaigns, or from their independent incursions across the frontier. Mihailovich described their raids as, and oppos, like torrential rains that fall from clouds. From these storms come great floods, until the streams leave their banks and overflow, and everything this water strikes, it takes, carries away, and moreover, destroys. Thus also the Turkish raiders do not linger long, but, wherever they strike, they burn, plunder, kill and destroy everything, so that for many years the cock will not crow there. The few Turkish accounts of incursions by the raiders enthusiastically confirm Mihailovich's account. The chronicler Ashik Pashazade served as a raider at Skopje during the 1430s and 1440s and, writing about the aftermath of a raid across the Sava in 1440, he comments, I bought a fine lad of 6 or 7 years. And on that raid, I acquired 7 slaves and slave girls from the raiders. It was such that, if the army had moved off, the crowd of prisoners would have been more numerous than the troops. And oppos. Hesa incursions by the raiders served 2 purposes. From a military aspect, they aimed to terrify the enemy and weaken the opposition, especially in advance of a major campaign. However, during the campaign itself, the indiscipline of the raiders could make them as much a hazard as an asset. A decree of 1560 illustrates this point. The Sultan had ordered the commander of the raiders, Turahan, to Azov, in the Crimea, to guard the district against Russian attacks. Turahan, however, found that the region was in the grip of a famine, with no opportunity for raiding or taking booty. In the circumstances, he could no longer control his men, and wrote to the Sultan, there is nowhere to plunder. The raiders and their officers are people who are suitable only for plunder. They cannot endure staying still for 4 or 5 days, and cannot be disciplined. Although effective within their own groups, they were not suitable for formal warfare. Apart from this military function, the booty which the raiders took supplied the markets of the empire, above all, with slaves. This traffic was also profitable to the sultans, who took a percentage of the prisoners as recruits for the janissaries or the palace schools. In addition, probably from the end of the 14th century, they also levied a toll on these captives, as their owners ferried them across the straits, from Europe to Asia Minor. 11. The form of warfare that the raiders practiced clearly went back to the beginnings of the empire. However, it was probably not until Ottoman power became firmly established in the Balkan Peninsula, towards the end of the reign of Murad I, that they emerged as a distinctive military organization. With the annexation of the Bulgarian principalities in the 1390s and the establishment of the Danube as the frontier with Hungary, the organization of the raiders probably took the form which it was to keep for the next 2 centuries. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the marcher lords emerged as leaders of the raiders. Particularly prominent in this respect was the Mihaglu family, who held hereditary lands at Vidin, a fortress on the Danube which looked across the river to the Kingdom of Hungary. Serving under these lords were officers, known as dovijas, and under them, the ordinary raiders. When the Sultan wished to levy them for a campaign, he would send, according to Spandowns, in the early 16th century, 1 month before the campaign, a messenger to warn them that they were to muster on such and such a day of the month, at such and such a place, where they would find a captain sent by the Sultan to lead them against the Christians. And oppos. Service as a raider was perhaps, in the early days, voluntary. By the 16th century, however, and probably much earlier, it had become customary to enroll and formally register the troops. A command to the Sanjak governor of Vidin, undated, but probably from the 16th century, gives an idea of the procedure. The Sanjak governor was to tour the towns and villages of Rumelia, and to conscript raiders who had a good horse, and weapons and armor suitable for campaign. He was also to levy the sons of dead and retired raiders. As with the Azabs, the registers recording the levies contained the names not only of each raider and his father, but also the name of a bailsman who would guarantee his appearance on campaign. At times of mobilization, the conscripts were to appear with a turban or red headgear, armed with a sword and beflagged lance. The Sanjak governor making the levy had presumably to forward a copy of the completed register to the palace. This was certainly the case in a command of 1,560, which informs the Sanjak governor of Vulk Vitran that a member of one of the palace cavalry divisions would be arriving to assist him in making a register of the raiders, and ordering him to send it to the palace as soon as it was complete. 12. Estimates vary on the total number of raiders at the Sultan's disposal. Jacopo di Promontorio in 1475 gives 8,000, of which 6,000 were available for campaign, while the other 2,000 remained behind to guard the frontier. In Jacopo's time and earlier, there may well have been others in the personal following of the marcher lords. A 16th century chronicle states that 20,000 accompanied Suleiman's first campaign in 1521, and this may have been a typical number for the century. Geoffroy in 1543 gives their number as 60,000. This figure, while probably an exaggeration, is perhaps not wholly fantastic, since it recalls what Kochi Bey was to write in the 1630s. Recalling the glorious 16th century, he notes that there used to be 20,000 registered raiders, but that when there was a campaign, the commander of the raiders crossed the Danube with 40 to 50,000 troops, some of these registered raiders, and some of them volunteers and other auxiliary troops who were skilled in horsemanship. Until the early decades of the 16th century, the raiders most probably served on campaign under the marcher lords of Roumelia. By the mid-16th century, their organization was into two wings, the left wing and the right wing, their attachment being according to the area and Roumelia where they lived. The names of the wings, however, the followers of Mihaglu and the followers of Turahan, show that the association with the marcher lords had continued at least in name. 13 The appearance in 1560 of a certain Turahan as a leader of the raiders suggests 14, if he was indeed a member of the Turahan-Olu dynasty, that a personal association between the raiders and the old marcher families may have lingered into the late 16th century. This was a time when the raiders lost their importance as a military force. Until the end of the 16th century, the raiders formed an important element in the Ottoman army, fighting in campaigns, both in Europe and Asia. Their most significant role had been as border warriors, especially in making attacks across the river frontiers, into the Kingdom of Hungary and, after the annexation of Bosnia in 1463, in launching raids from there into Venetian and Hungarian territory. Their raids north of the Danube and, in 1498, even into Poland, seem to have become particularly intense during the reign of Bayezid II, a period when the Sultan undertook little formal warfare into Europe. In 1526, however, their role changed. The Battle of Mohacs brought to an end the independent Kingdom of Hungary and, in 1541, Hungary, or that part of it under Ottoman suzerainty, became an Ottoman province. With the disappearance of the old Danube frontier, some of the functions of the raiders seem also to have vanished. The new frontier with Austria seems to have been less vulnerable to raids than the old Hungarian frontier, especially with the construction of a line of effective border defenses. Regular plundering raids, such as Mihailovich had described in the 15th century, came to an end. The law books for the Sanjak of Smederevo on the Danube provide an illustration of this change. In the version compiled in 1516, one clause lists the tolls levied at the quay of Smederevo on the categories of booty which the raiders brought across the Danube after their razzias. In the version of 1560, this clause has disappeared. 15. Nonetheless, even if the annual raids across the borders came to an end, the raiders still kept their old function of harrying the enemy in advance of a campaign, and also of mounting punitive expeditions outside periods of formal warfare. When, for example, the Sultan received reports of Austrian attacks on Transylvania in 1565, a year when the siege of Malta absorbed most of the empire's military resources, he ordered the Sanjak governor of Chernomen to go with the raiders of the left wing, followers of Mihaglu, to Srem, and to plunder the enemy's territory. He was to raid the abject infidels, enslave their children and wives, plunder and pillage their possessions and properties, so that it would be a lesson to them. 16 The same command orders him not to lose any regular troops, for whom the raiders were, on this expedition, a substitute. The end of the raiders as an effective military force came in 1595. In this year, the Grand Vizier, Khoja, the elder, Shinan Pasha, led his expedition into Wallachia. His army included a large contingent of raiders and, as these waited to cross the Danube at Giurgiu, back into Ottoman territory, the Wallachian forces attacked and destroyed them almost to a man. Most of the raiders, writes the Ottoman historian, Naima, were on the opposite bank, and not a man of them escaped. At that moment, the route of the raiders was cut off, and they became extinct. 17 In fact, the remnants of the organization lingered on. In the 1630s, Kochi Bey reported that there were 2,000, but that the remainder had either renounced their status, or become absorbed into other army units. The demise of the raiders' organization does not, however, mean that the Ottomans ceased to harry enemy territory as a military tactic. It seems, however, that from the end of the 16th century, the Tatar troops attached to the Khan of the Crimea became more important in this role. They had participated in earlier campaigns, but not prominently. Indeed, in the mid-16th century, Lutfi Pasha had warned against employing the Tatars. It is true, he wrote, that the Tatars are subjects of the Ottoman dynasty, but they are a refractory people, and cannot be obliged to serve on campaign. With the end of the raiders, however, their military importance increased. Between the late 14th century, therefore, and the end of the 16th, the Timar holding cavalry, the Janissaries, the 6 divisions, the Azubs and the raiders had been the most prominent contingents of Ottoman fighting troops. At the same time, the Sultan maintained a body of non-combatants who acted as pioneers for the army. These were the footmen, Yahyas, and the exemptees, Muselims. It is possible that they originated in the 14th century as bodies of, respectively, infantry and cavalry, but that by the early 15th century they had lost their combatant role. Like the Timar holding cavalrymen, they received no pay from the treasury. Instead, they raised the money for campaigns from within their own organizations. The Sultan levied these men in Anatolia and Rumelia, and divided them into groups of 30, allocating to each group a plot of land for cultivation, and exempting them from taxes on their produce and from extraordinary taxation. In each of these groups, 5 men were campaigners, who went to war in turn, and the rest were helpers, who were liable to pay 50 akshas each for the maintenance of the campaigner. A law book of 1531 records that, until the time of Bayezid II, the helpers paid this amount each year, regardless of whether there was a campaign or not. To prevent disputes between the two groups, Bayezid decreed that, henceforth, the money was due only when there was a campaign. 18. The organization of these men resembled the organization of Timar holders under a Sanjak governor. Both the footmen and the exemptees in a particular area came under the command of their own governor, rather than of the governor of the Sanjak where they held their lands. Also, like the Timar holding cavalrymen, a number of them served as officers, with the title troop commander or infantry commander and apas. In Rumelia, the Turkish tribemen, the Uruks, performed the same duties as the footmen in Anatolia, on the basis, it seems, of a similar organization. Altogether, these military auxiliaries were very numerous. In 1521, in Anatolia, there were officially 2,584 groups of exemptees and 7,668 of footmen. In Rumelia in 1552, there were 1,377 groups of Uruks and 810 of exemptees. 19 Their duties, according to Ain Ali in the early 17th century, were in dragging cannon, clearing roads and bringing up provisions for the army. These were undoubtedly their most basic functions, but clearly their duties were in fact more varied. For example, a law book of Gallipoli, dated 1518, requires the mounted exemptees, among other things, to keep watch on the coasts and harbors, and immediately to give notice to the villages and fortresses if they see any ship that might pose a danger. In addition, they had to perform heavy duties in the Gallipoli naval arsenal, such as dragging ships onto the dry land. During the course of the 16th century, the organization of footmen and exemptees seems to have become disordered and unreliable. Certainly, a command of 1,540, ordering the conscription of new recruits and the proper registration of members and of the lands which they held, 20 suggests that desertion was common. In 1582, the Sultan ordered the abolition of both groups. Immediately afterwards, he changed his mind and conscription began again. 21 By 1600, however, the two corps of footmen and exemptees no longer existed. Ain Ali in 1609 noted that the former members had all been registered as ordinary tax-paying subjects.